The millionaire accidentally reconnected with his first love on a rainy afternoon. A few days later, the woman suddenly received a text message that made her extremely scared. The rain fell in relentless sheets, the kind that blurred the city into a smudged painting of grey and glistening lights. Emma Ward hunched under her flimsy umbrella, her sneakers splashing through shallow pools as she weaved between the throngs of commuters. The weight of her damp diner uniform clung to her frame, amplifying the chill that gnawed at her bones. Ahead, the blare of a car horn sliced through the rain-soaked chaos. A sleek, red luxury car jerked to a halt, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. A man stepped out, visibly annoyed, his tailored coat catching droplets as he glanced at his watch. Emma rounded the corner, her gaze fixed on the ground, her thoughts swirling with a mental checklist. Rent due. Next week. The fridge nearly empty. Her double shift starting in less than 10 minutes. She barely registered the figure in front of her until she collided with him, her umbrella slipping from her grasp and clattering onto the sidewalk. "Watch where—" the man began, his tone sharp, but the words faltered as his eyes met hers. "I'm so sorry," Emma stammered, dropping to her knees to retrieve her umbrella. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks as she avoided his gaze. "I wasn't paying attention. No, it's— Wait, Emma?" Her head snapped up, her brows knitting in confusion. The man before her looked familiar, though his polished appearance and sharp features made it hard to place him. "It's me," he said, a tentative smile spreading across his face. "Edward Arnold, from Crestwood." The name struck her sharply, evoking recollections of sun-drenched bike rides and whispered secrets beneath the ancient oak tree in their small hometown. "Edward?" she echoed, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. Wow, it's been years." He responded, wiping the rain from his sleeve. "I almost didn't recognize you." Emma felt an unspoken weight settle between them, a gulf carved by time and circumstance. She straightened, clutching her umbrella, her gaze flitting to the red car behind him. "You're doing well, I see," she ventured, her voice tinged with something that wasn't quite envy, but close enough to sting. Edward chuckled, a warm, rich sound that momentarily softened the sharp edges of the city around them. "Not as well as you think. I'm just the driver. For a millionaire, though," he added with a self-deprecating shrug, "pays the bills." Her eyes flicked to his tailored coat and polished shoes. It was hard to reconcile this composed, confident man with the boy who once scraped his knees climbing trees and swore he'd never eat green beans. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "at least one of us escaped Crestwood." "What about you?" he asked, his tone shifting to something gentler. "What brings you here?" Before she could answer, the alarm on her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. She silenced it quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. "I work down the street," she said, nodding vaguely. "The Oakview Diner. It's nothing fancy, but it keeps me busy." Edward's expression softened, his curiosity evident. "Maybe I'll stop by sometime. Their coffee any good?" She laughed lightly, the sound a faint echo of the girl she used to be. "Depends on who's making it." "I'll take my chances," he replied, stepping aside as she began to walk past. "It's really good to see you, Emma." "You too, Edward," she said, glancing back briefly before disappearing into the crowd. Edward stood there for a moment, his coat gradually darkening under the rain. The city churned around him, indifferent to his thoughts. The brief encounter had stirred something, nostalgia perhaps, or maybe regret for the years lost between them. Inside the diner, the familiar clang of dishes and the murmur of customers wrapped around her like a threadbare blanket. Emma tied her apron with quick, practiced motions, trying to shake the unease that lingered from their encounter. Edward Arnold. Crestwood's golden boy. She hadn't thought about him in years, not intentionally anyway. Yet now, the sight of him, so polished, so far removed from the boy who once dared her to climb the tallest oak tree, left a dull ache she couldn't quite name. For Edward, the rain was suddenly less cold, the city a little less grey. He stepped back into the car, gripping the steering wheel with a quiet resolve. Oakview Diner, he murmured to himself, committing the name to memory. Out of habit, Emma glanced out the window toward the street again. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and through the glass she could just make out the tail lights of his car as it pulled away. Emma exhaled sharply, turning back to the counter as a customer waved her over. There were tables to clear, orders to take, and shifts to endure. She could keep busy. She would keep busy. But even as she smiled and served coffee, the memory of Edward's eyes, curious, searching, lingered like a thread she couldn't quite unravel. Neither of them noticed the shadow across the street, a figure watching from beneath a dripping awning, a phone held loosely in one hand. The rain continued to fall, but the stage was set for a reunion neither of them could have anticipated. The Oakview Diner buzzed with the usual midday chaos, a low hum of conversation, the metallic clang of utensils against plates, and the rhythmic hiss of the coffee machine. The diner smelled of burnt toast and fresh bacon, a comforting medley of scents that Emma had long since stopped noticing. She moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing a tray of plates in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. At a corner booth near the window, Edward Arnold sat nursing a cup of coffee. The booth had become his regular spot in the past week, always during Emma's shifts, though he never admitted that part out loud. He watched as she approached, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper, perhaps recognition, perhaps hesitation. "Back again?" she said, setting down a plate of pancakes in front of him. Her tone was light, but the tension in her posture gave her away. "Pancakes are hard to beat," Edward replied, his smile warm and unassuming. "Or maybe it's the company." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't quite suppress a small, reluctant smile. "You're starting to make the regulars jealous. Mrs. Harper thinks you're taking her favorite seat." Edward chuckled, leaning back slightly. "I'll fight her for it, if I have to. She looks tough, but I think I can take her." Emma let out a laugh, short, genuine, and entirely unexpected. It was the kind of sound that startled even her, a glimpse of the girl she used to be, before the weight of adulthood settled on her shoulders. "Anything else you need?" she asked, quickly regaining her composure. Edward tilted his head, his gaze soft but probing. "Maybe just a little conversation, if you have time, that is." Her fingers tightened around the handle of the coffee pot, and for a moment she considered brushing him off. But there was something disarming about him, something that reminded her of a simpler time, when life wasn't measured in overdue bills and double shifts. She slid into the seat across from him, glancing at the clock on the wall. "You've got 5 minutes." "Fair enough," he said, setting his fork down. "So tell me, how does a girl from Crestwood end up here?" Emma shrugged, her eyes flicking toward the counter, where her co-worker Brenda was refilling a sugar dispenser. "Chicago's big enough to get lost in. That's all I needed." "And yet here you are, not lost at all," Edward said, his voice thoughtful. "Seems like you've got things figured out." She let out a hollow laugh. "If waiting tables and dodging rent collectors counts as figured out, then sure." Edward's smile faltered, and a shadow of concern crossed his face. "You always did undersell yourself, you know that." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her brows knitting as she glanced at the screen. The call came from an unknown number, and her thumb hovered over the decline button before she silenced it entirely. "Everything okay?" Edward asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Yeah," Emma said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. "Just a telemarketer or something." Edward nodded, though the tightness in her expression lingered in his mind. They're relentless these days. She stood abruptly, smoothing the wrinkles in her apron. "I should get back to work. Enjoy your pancakes." He watched her retreat to the counter, her movements brisk and purposeful. But her shoulders were tense, her hands fidgeting with the coffee pot, even when it wasn't in use. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her unease than a mere telemarketer. He caught a glimpse of her phone, buzzing once more, in her pocket. She glanced at it briefly, her jaw tightening, before she quickly turned her attention back to the orders pinned above the grill. Edward sipped his coffee, his gaze drifting to the raindrops streaking the window. Memories of their childhood in Crestwood flooded back. Long summer afternoons, the sound of their laughter echoing through the woods, and the unspoken bond they'd shared. He wondered how much of that girl still existed beneath the guarded exterior Emma now wore like armor. Across the diner, Emma caught him watching her. She gave him a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Still working on that coffee?" she called out, her voice light but distant. Edward held up his cup in mock defense. "Just savoring it." She nodded and turned away, leaving him with the unmistakable sense that she was holding something back. While the steady stream of customers made the diner's door jingle open and close, Edward silently made a decision. He didn't know what was haunting Emma, but he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Not if he could help it. The rain outside continued to fall, the city carrying on as if oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within the walls of the Oakview Diner. The Oakview Diner had quieted as the afternoon lull set in. The clatter of dishes was sporadic now, replaced by low murmurs of conversation. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze darting to the phone in her pocket. It hadn't stopped buzzing since her shift began. She slipped behind the counter, away from the customer's view, and pulled the phone out. Another message. Her throat tightened as she read the words. "End it with him. Now. Don't make me remind you what I'm capable of." Her fingers trembled as she deleted the text, her mind racing. Stephen had always known how to wield fear, his threats sharp and calculated. Emma shoved the phone back into her pocket, her chest tightening as she forced her breathing to steady. "Hey, Em, you good?" Brenda's voice broke through her thoughts. The older waitress leaned against the counter, her sharp eyes scanning Emma's face. "Yeah," Emma replied too quickly, plastering on a tight smile. "Just a long day." Brenda gave her a skeptical look, but didn't press. "If you say so. Table 4 needs a refill." Emma grabbed the coffee pot and headed toward the booth where Edward sat, his long frame relaxed as he scrolled through his phone. When he noticed her approach, he set it down and offered a smile that felt too kind, too understanding. "Coffee?" she asked, pouring it without waiting for an answer. "Sure, but only if you sit for a minute," he said, his tone light, but his gaze searching. "I can't," she replied quickly, straightening up. "Too much to do." "Emma," he said softly, his voice grounding her mid-step. She hesitated, her back to him, before finally turning. "What?" "You've been off. I don't want to pry, but if something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong," she cut him off, her tone sharper than intended. She immediately softened, her hands gripping the coffee pot tighter. "I'm fine, really." Edward didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly, respecting the boundary she had just drawn. "All right, just... You know I'm here, right? If you need anything?" "Yeah, thanks." She forced another smile and returned to the counter, her heart thudding in her chest. Hours later, the diner emptied further, leaving only a few stragglers and the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. Emma sat on a stool behind the counter, pretending to be engrossed in reorganizing the sugar packets. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't check it immediately this time, but the weight of it pressed against her like a physical presence. When she finally glanced at the screen, the sight of Stephen's name made her stomach lurch. "I'm serious, Emma. End it, or we'll have a real problem." Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She deleted the message as quickly as it had appeared, her jaw tightening with frustration and fear. "Emma?" Edward's voice startled her, and she turned abruptly, nearly knocking over the coffee pot. "What is it?" she asked, her tone too defensive. Edward frowned. "You didn't hear me calling you?" "Sorry. Just tired, I guess." She avoided his eyes, busying herself with wiping down the counter. Edward leaned against the edge of the counter, his presence steady and unyielding. "You can tell me if something's wrong, you know." Emma's hand froze mid-swipe, but she didn't look up. "Why do you keep asking that?" "Because you're not fine, no matter how many times you say you are," Edward said gently. "You're distracted. You keep looking at your phone like it's going to explode. And honestly, it's starting to worry me." She finally met his gaze, her expression guarded. "I'm fine, Edward. Really." The sincerity in his concern was almost too much, and for a moment, she wanted to tell him everything. But the thought of Stephen finding out, of what he might do, kept her silent. Edward sighed, pushing off the counter. "All right, I'll back off, for now." Emma watched him return to his booth, her chest tightening. The storm she was trying to keep at bay felt closer than ever, the waves lapping at the edges of her carefully constructed walls. By the time her shift ended, the rain outside had lessened to a drizzle. Emma stepped into the cool night air, her breath visible in the faint glow of the streetlights. She glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Stephen. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she didn't have the strength to look. She shoved it deep into her pocket and started walking briskly toward home, the wet pavement glistening under her sneakers. Across the street, a figure lingered under the cover of a bus stop, their silhouette shrouded in the dim light. Emma didn't notice them as she disappeared around the corner, her thoughts consumed by the weight of secrets she could no longer carry alone. In the distance, the figure pulled out a phone, their movements deliberate. A call was made, a low voice murmuring something into the receiver before they too melted into the shadows. The storm wasn't over. Not yet. The small bistro was tucked away in one of Chicago's quieter neighborhoods, its dim lighting and soft jazz music a deliberate departure from the chaos of the Oakview diner. Edward had chosen the spot carefully, hoping the intimate atmosphere might coax Emma to relax. When she arrived, Emma hesitated at the entrance, smoothing her coat nervously. The faint drizzle outside clung to her hair and jacket, giving her an air of fragility she didn't intend to convey. Edward waved from a corner table, standing as she approached. "You made it," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "Barely," she replied, offering a small, wary smile. "I got lost 3 times. "Well, you're here now," Edward said, his tone warm. "And trust me, the food's worth the detour." As the waiter approached, Emma busied herself with the menu, her fingers tracing the edge of the laminated paper. Edward watched her, his eyes soft with curiosity. "I guessed and ordered us some appetizers," he said. "Hope that's okay." "Sure," Emma replied, setting the menu down. Less pressure. The conversation began easily enough, drifting toward memories of their childhood. They spoke of summer afternoons at the creek, makeshift bike ramps, and the old treehouse Edward's dad had helped them build. "You used to be fearless," Edward said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Climbing the highest branches like you had wings." Emma laughed lightly, though it felt forced. "Yeah, well, a lot changes when you grow up." Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What about now? Do you still climb trees?" "Not exactly," she replied, fiddling with the corner of her napkin. "My life's different now." Edward caught the flicker of hesitation in her voice. "Different how?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "Just different. That's all." The appetizers arrived, momentarily breaking the tension. As they shared the plates, Edward began recounting his move to Chicago. "I got lucky," he said, carefully choosing his words. "Landed a decent job driving for a guy with deep pockets. He's not bad to work for, honestly." Emma raised an eyebrow, her fork pausing mid-air. "Driving? You mean that car you got out of the other day?" Edward nodded, his expression relaxed. "Yeah, belongs to the boss. Perks of the job, I guess." Emma tilted her head, studying him. Must be some job to come with perks like that. Edward shrugged, deflecting the question with practiced ease. Despite his casual tone, Emma sensed there was more to the story. She opened her mouth to press him further, but stopped herself, unwilling to shift the spotlight away from her carefully guarded secrets. The rest of the dinner unfolded with similar half-revealed truths. Emma redirected the conversation whenever Edward's questions edged too close to her personal life. He noticed, of course, but chose not to push, filing her deflections away for later consideration. As the plates were cleared and the waiter brought the check, Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You know, you've got a habit of changing the subject," he said, his tone light, but his meaning clear. Emma blinked, taken aback. "I don't know what you mean." "You do," he said, with a small smile. "But I'll let it slide. For now." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes remained guarded. "Thanks for dinner, Edward. It was nice." Later that night, as Emma walked home, the soft glow of streetlights painted the wet pavement in golden hues. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration sharp against her thigh. She stopped under an awning, her breath visible in the crisp night air, and reluctantly pulled the phone from her pocket. "You can't hide forever." The message was simple, but heavy, its weight pressing down on her like a physical force. She deleted it immediately, shoving the phone back into her coat. Her steps quickened as she reached her building, her heart pounding louder with every echo of her footsteps. Unlocking the door with shaking hands, she stepped inside, bolting it behind her. She leaned against the cold wood, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her breathing. But even within the safety of her apartment, the message lingered, an unspoken promise of what Stephen could still take from her. In the distance, a car engine idled briefly before fading into the night. Emma's eyes flicked to the window, but the street below was empty, save for the flickering shadows of passing headlights. She turned away, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The storm wasn't just outside, it was closing in, relentless and unavoidable. And for the first time in a long while, Emma wasn't sure if she could face it alone. The Oakview diner buzzed with its usual midday energy, the chatter of customers mingling with the clang of dishes and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. Emma moved between tables, her focus wavering despite her best efforts. She kept glancing at the clock above the counter, her nerves fraying as if she could sense something brewing. At his usual corner booth, Edward sat with his coffee, casually scrolling through his phone. He looked up every so often, catching Emma's fleeting moments of unease. He hadn't pressed her since their dinner a few nights ago, but her guarded behavior lingered in his mind, like an unanswered question. The doorbell jingled sharply, the sound cutting through the din. Emma turned instinctively, her body stiffening as Stephen strode in. His presence was commanding, his tailored jacket and sharp gaze at odds with the humble surroundings. "Emma?" Stephen called out, his voice deceptively calm. Her blood ran cold. The tray in her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to breathe. "Stephen," she said, her voice low and measured. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, just checking in," he replied, his smile thin. "Nice place. Cozy." Stephen's gaze flicked past her and landed on Edward. The recognition was instant, and his smile widened into something far less friendly. "Well, well," Stephen said, crossing the room in a few deliberate strides. "If it isn't Edward Arnold." Edward looked up, his brows furrowing. "Do I know you?" "We've never met," Stephen said smoothly, extending a hand. "Stephen Hale, Emma's ex-husband." Edward's eyes darted to Emma, who stood frozen, her face pale. "Ex-husband," he repeated, his tone careful but edged with surprise. Stephen let out a humorless laugh. "Ah, she didn't tell you. No surprise there. Emma's always been good at keeping secrets." "Stephen, that's enough," Emma snapped, her voice trembling. But Stephen ignored her, turning his attention back to Edward. "And what about you? What secrets are you hiding, huh? Because I'd bet Emma doesn't know the full story either." Edward straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but—" "Oh, it's simple," Stephen interrupted, his tone casual but cutting. "I just think it's fair that everyone gets to know the truth." He turned to the rest of the diner, his voice raising slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, did you know our friend Edward here is a millionaire? Quite the leap from small-town boy to the big leagues, huh?" The words landed like a slap, drawing murmurs from the surrounding tables. Emma's heart sank as she glanced at Edward, whose expression hardened. Stephen didn't stop. "And yet, here you are, playing the humble driver. Why's that, Edward? Trying to impress her? Or were you just hoping she wouldn't figure it out?" "That's enough," Edward said, his voice sharp and controlled. He rose to his feet, towering over Stephen, but Stephen barely flinched. "Is it? Because I think we're just getting started," Stephen said, his smile venomous. "How about we talk about why Emma's so reluctant to share her past?" "Oh, that's right. She's been married before. To me." The room appeared to stifle its emotions. Emma's vision became blurred as humiliation swept over her like a tsunami. "Stephen, stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. But the damage was done. Edward's stunned gaze shifted to Emma, his confusion and hurt unspoken but painfully clear. Emma couldn't bear it. She spun around and sprinted towards the rear of the diner, her footsteps resonating against the tiled floor. Edward stayed rooted in place, his mind reeling. Stephen's words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. "Well," Stephen said, smoothing his jacket, "that was enlightening, wasn't it?" Edward didn't respond. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Stephen smirked. "Good luck with that one, Edward. She's got more baggage than you know." With that, he strode out of the diner, leaving Edward standing alone in the wake of the chaos. In the alley behind the diner, Emma leaned against the brick wall, her breaths shallow and rapid. Tears blurred her vision as she tried to steady herself. How could Stephen do this? How could he expose everything she'd tried so hard to keep hidden? Footsteps approached and she stiffened, wiping at her face. "Emma." Edward's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her chest ache. She turned to face him, her defenses crumbling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward asked, his tone not accusatory but pained. "I was scared," Emma admitted, her voice breaking, "of how you'd see me, of what it might mean." Edward studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma alone in the cold alley. She sank to the ground, her tears falling freely now. The storm she had tried so hard to avoid had finally arrived, and she had no idea how to weather it. The days after Stephen's public ambush stretched into a blur for Emma. She buried herself in work at the Oakview diner, taking every shift she could, and avoiding the curious glances of co-workers and regulars. The diner's noise, plates clattering, coffee brewing, forks scraping against ceramic, was her only reprieve from the deafening silence in her mind. But no matter how hard she tried, memories of that afternoon clawed their way back. At night, when the world quieted and her apartment was cloaked in shadows, the shame became unbearable. She replayed Stephen's words, his cruel smile, and Edward's betrayed expression. She would lie in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, tears slipping silently down her face. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from Brenda, concerned about her sudden withdrawal, and Edward's name glaring at her screen in missed calls she couldn't bring herself to return. The memories of Edward's warmth, his laughter, and his kindness haunted her. But they were always followed by the raw sting of his pained question. "Why didn't you tell me?" Across the city, Edward sat in the quiet stillness of his penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline of Chicago. The city lights danced on the surface of his untouched glass of bourbon, but he barely noticed. He'd thrown himself into work, board meetings, charity events, late-night calls with his company's European partners, but none of it filled the void. Every so often, his mind wandered back to the diner, to Emma's tearful apology in the alley. The betrayal deeply wounded her. She hadn't trusted him with the truth about Stephen, about her past. But his own dishonesty gnawed at him too. He'd built his interactions with her on a foundation of half-truths, hiding his wealth behind a fabricated persona. He had told himself it was to protect their connection, but now he wasn't sure if he'd been protecting Emma or himself. Late one evening, Edward found himself standing in front of his old car, the one he rarely drove anymore. It wasn't sleek or luxurious like the others in his garage. It was simple, a relic from the life he'd left behind in Crestwood. Running his fingers over the faded paint, he thought of Emma and the unassuming girl he once knew, the girl who had climbed trees without hesitation and dared him to jump from the highest branches. But that girl wasn't the woman he had seen in the alley, trembling under the weight of a history she hadn't shared. Emma continued to avoid Edward's calls, though her heart twisted with every notification. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she collapsed onto a couch, her body aching from hours on her feet. Her phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't Edward. "Ignoring me won't help, Emma." Stephen's message caused her blood to run cold. She clenched the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let him win. She opened the message, her thumb hesitating over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Stephen to leave her alone, to scream at him, to threaten him back. But all she could type was, "Please stop." His reply was immediate. "You can't run from me, Emma. You know that." The phone slipped from her hands, landing on the floor with a dull thud. She curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket tightly around her, the familiar grip of fear squeezing her chest. Meanwhile, Edward stared at his phone, debating whether to try calling her one last time. The silence between them felt insurmountable, but his mind refused to rest. He scrolled through his messages, rereading their last text conversation before the confrontation with Stephen. Her responses had been curt, but warm, her smiles carefully tucked into her words. Now, those same messages felt hollow, revealing none of the turmoil she'd hidden. For the first time in days, Edward allowed himself to wonder, had he failed her too? He thought about the fragility in her voice that day, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of her confession. As much as her dishonesty had hurt him, his own fear of being seen for who he truly was had done the same to her. The storm continued, relentless on both sides of the city. Emma clung to her routine, hoping the work would drown out her shame. Edward buried himself in obligations, seeking distractions from the hollowness in his chest. But in the quiet moments, when neither could run from their thoughts, both Emma and Edward wrestled with the same question. Had their fear destroyed something worth saving? For Emma, the answer was tangled in the shame of her past and the lingering shadow of Stephen's threats. For Edward, the answer lay in the realization that he had maintained a distance, even as he reached out to her. The city carried on around them, but for now, they stood still, separated by the walls they had both built. And yet, somewhere deep inside, the faintest flicker of hope remained. A question lingered, unspoken but persistent. What if it's not too late? The evening air was heavy with moisture as Edward parked his car a block away from the Oakview diner. The drizzle from earlier had thickened into a mist, blurring the city lights into soft halos. He sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered his thoughts. He wasn't sure if Emma would even talk to him, but the distance between them had grown unbearable. The bell over the diner door jingled as Edward stepped inside. The warmth of the bustling diner contrasted sharply with the chill outside, but his eyes scanned the room, looking for her. She wasn't at the counter or on the floor. Brenda, the older waitress, caught his eye and gestured toward the back. "She's finishing up in the alley. You should go talk to her." Edward nodded, his chest tightening as he made his way toward the rear door. In the dimly lit alley, Emma stood by the dumpster, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at her phone. Stephen's most recent message burned on the screen. "If you think he can protect you, you're wrong. This isn't over, Emma." Her thumb hovered over the delete button, but her mind was a storm of fear and exhaustion. She barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching until a familiar voice cut through the haze. "Emma." Stephen's voice was calm, almost cordial, but it carried a dangerous edge. She flinched and turned to see him standing a few feet away, his silhouette sharp under the flickering light of the alley's lone lamp. "What are you doing here, Stephen?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at steadiness. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, his expression cold. "Just checking in, making sure you haven't forgotten our little conversation." "There's nothing to talk about," Emma said, her voice firmer now. "Oh, I think there is," Stephen replied, his smile turning predatory. "You think running to him will solve your problems?" "He doesn't know you, Emma. Not really. But I do." "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though the way her voice quivered betrayed her words. Stephen took another step forward, his tone darkening. "You should be." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Both of them turned as Edward emerged from the shadows. His expression hardened the moment he saw Stephen. "What's going on here?" Edward asked, his voice steady but low. Stephen chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Ah, the benevolent protector." Perfect timing. Edward ignored the jab, his eyes locked on Emma. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded quickly, but her posture was tense and her arms still crossed tightly around herself. Stephen's smirk grew wider as he stepped toward Edward. "You don't belong here, Arnold. This is between me and her." "It doesn't look that way to me," Edward replied, stepping in front of Emma. Stephen's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You think you can just step in and fix everything? You don't even know who she really is." "And you think that justifies this?" Edward shot back, his voice rising. "Whatever you've done to her, it ends here." Stephen's face darkened, and in one swift motion, he grabbed a glass bottle from the dumpster's edge. You don't know when to quit, do you? Stephen, stop! Emma screamed, but it was too late. A sickening crack sounded as the bottle swung through the air, catching Edward on the side of his head. He staggered back, his hand shooting to the wound as blood began to trickle down his temple. Edward! Emma rushed forward, catching him as he started to collapse. Stephen dropped the bottle, its shards scattering across the ground. He stepped back, his expression shifting from rage to something almost regretful before he turned and ran into the night. The world felt like it had slowed as Emma cradled Edward's head in her lap. Edward, please, stay with me, she begged, her voice shaking. His eyes fluttered open briefly, but he didn't respond. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice guided her through the panic, but her mind raced as she pressed her hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the alley. Emma's tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Edward. I'm so sorry." When the paramedics arrived, Emma refused to leave his side, climbing into the ambulance with him despite their protests. The ride to the hospital was a blur, the cold sterility of the emergency room a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. As they wheeled Edward away, Emma collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs, her hands still stained with his blood. The weight of guilt and fear pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. She stared at the double doors that had swallowed Edward, her mind consumed by one thought. If he didn't make it, she would never forgive herself. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile hospital room. Emma sat hunched in a chair by Edward's bedside, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. Dark circles framed her eyes, remnants of a sleepless night spent praying for Edward to wake up. His head was bandaged, the wound now hidden beneath layers of gauze. The sight of him, so still and vulnerable, broke her in ways she hadn't thought possible. She had tried to stay strong, but the weight of guilt pressed down on her with each passing second. "You have to wake up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, Edward. I can't do this without you." Her phone buzzed on the side table. She glanced at it briefly, knowing it was another message from Stephen. She didn't need to read it to know the contents. He wouldn't stop until he shattered her world. A soft groan pulled her attention back to Edward. His eyelids fluttered, his brow furrowing slightly. Emma shot to her feet, her breath catching. "Edward," she said, leaning closer, her voice trembling. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they landed on her. "Emma," he murmured, his voice hoarse. A sob escaped her lips, and she covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're awake," she choked out. "Oh, thank God, you're awake." Edward blinked, his gaze flicking around the room before settling back on her. "What happened?" Emma hesitated, her hands trembling. "You were hurt," she said softly. "Stephen, he attacked you." Recognition dawned in Edward's eyes, followed by a flash of anger. "Where is he?" "He's gone," Emma replied, shaking her head. "I called the police, but he ran before they got there." Edward exhaled heavily, wincing as the movement caused pain. Emma reached out instinctively, her hand hovering above his before pulling back. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "This is all my fault." "Emma," Edward said, his tone gentle despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "You didn't do this." "He did." She shook her head, fresh tears falling. "You don't understand. I should have told you everything. About Stephen, about my past. I was just so scared. I thought if you knew, you'd see me differently, and I couldn't bear that." Edward studied her, his expression softening. "Emma, I don't care about your past. I care about you." Her shoulders shook as she let out a bitter laugh. You say that now. But Stephen was right. You don't really know me. You don't know the things I've done, the things I've been through. Then tell me, Edward said firmly, his gaze unwavering. Help me understand. Emma hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. But then she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she wasn't broken, but whole. Taking a deep breath, she began. Stephen wasn't just my ex-husband. He was abusive. He controlled everything, what I wore, who I talked to, even how I thought. When I finally left, he made sure I couldn't forget him. He's been sending me messages, threatening me, trying to pull me back into his world. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. But then you came into my life, and he saw it as a way to hurt me again. And now you're lying here because of me. Edward reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Emma, look at me, he said softly. When she finally met his gaze, he continued, None of this is your fault. Stephen is a monster, but you're not responsible for what he's done. She nodded, though the guilt still lingered. I should have told you from the beginning. I was just so scared you'd walk away. Edward's lips curled into a faint smile. I'm not going anywhere. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were accompanied by a flicker of relief. Thank you, she whispered. Edward hesitated before speaking again. I owe you an apology too. She frowned. For what? For not being honest with you about who I am, he admitted. I should have told you the truth about my wealth and about my life. I thought I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself from being seen as someone other than just Edward, the boy you knew from Crestwood. Emma's heart ached at his words. You didn't have to hide from me, she said softly. I know that now, Edward replied. No more secrets for either of us. She nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. No more secrets. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air between them felt lighter. The weight of their pasts hadn't disappeared, but together they were ready to face it. As Emma sat back down, her hand resting in Edward's, the steady beeping of the heart monitor felt less like a reminder of fear and more like a promise of hope. For the first time, they were finally moving forward, together. It had been 2 weeks since the night in the alley. Emma sat in her living room, scrolling through her phone. The news of Stephen's arrest had just broken. Local man apprehended in connection to violent altercation at Oakview Diner. She exhaled, her chest feeling lighter for the first time in days. The security footage from the alley had been enough to secure his arrest. The police assured her Stephen wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that she could move on. Edward, still recovering, sat on the couch of his penthouse, watching the news coverage. His bandaged head throbbed faintly, but the pain was manageable. Seeing Stephen's smug face flash on the screen filled him with satisfaction. Justice, he muttered to himself. Despite the relief, something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't place. Emma had been through so much, and though Stephen was out of the picture, Edward knew life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges. The unexpected challenge came that very afternoon. Emma's phone rang, and she answered hesitantly when she saw the unfamiliar number. Hello? The voice on the other end was sharp, familiar, and laced with malice. Emma, dear, it's been a long time. Her blood ran cold. Vivian, she whispered. Vivian, her estranged stepmother, laughed lightly. So you do remember me. How sweet. I hear you've made yourself a rather influential friend. How fortunate for you. Emma tightened her grip on the phone. What do you want? What I've always wanted, darling. A little compensation for the years I wasted on your father. Let's say $50,000. That should suffice. Emma's heart pounded. I don't have that kind of money. Of course you don't, Vivian said smoothly. But your boyfriend does. And if you'd like me to keep quiet about our delightful family history and your connection to him, I suggest you convince him to help. The line went dead, leaving Emma trembling. Emma told Edward everything that evening. They sat on his couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She's vile, Emma said, her voice shaking. She treated me horribly after my dad died, and now she's back, looking for money. She wants 50,000, or she'll try to ruin us. Edward listened quietly, his jaw tightening with each word. When she finished, he leaned forward, his expression firm. We'll deal with this, he said. How? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward reached for his phone. I'll give her the money. No! Emma grabbed his arm. You don't have to do that. She's just trying to manipulate us. I know, Edward said gently. But this isn't just about her. It's about protecting you. If money makes her disappear, then it's worth it. Emma shook her head. I don't want you to feel like you have to fix this. It's not your responsibility. Edward placed his hand over hers. Emma, this isn't about responsibility. It's about choice. I choose to protect you. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded reluctantly. Okay, but this doesn't feel right. The next morning, Edward met Vivian in the lobby of his office building. Her presence was as venomous as Emma had described. Mr. Arnold, Vivian said, her lips curling into a smile. Such a pleasure to meet you. Edward didn't return her smile. He slid an envelope across the table. Here's the money. Take it and stay away from Emma. Permanently. Vivian's eyes gleamed as she opened the envelope, her fingers counting the bills. Pleasure doing business with you, she said with a smirk. Edward leaned forward, his voice low. If I hear you've contacted her again, I won't handle it this kindly. Do you understand? Vivian's smile faltered briefly, but she recovered quickly. Crystal clear, she said, standing. Have a lovely day. As she left, Edward felt a mix of relief and anger. Although he had safeguarded Emma, the notion of someone taking advantage of her susceptibility left him with a bitter aftertaste. That evening, Edward sat with Emma in her apartment. She's gone, he said simply. Emma exhaled, tears slipping down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. Edward took her hands in his. Emma, I've been thinking. There are so many people out there, women like you, who have been through things they didn't deserve. We can't fix the world, but maybe we can help. What do you mean? She asked. I want to start a foundation, Edward said, his voice steady. A place where women can go to find safety, resources, and a way out. No one should have to face this alone. Emma stared at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and awe. That's incredible, she said softly. It's the least I can do, Edward replied, for you, and for everyone who's been in your shoes. In that moment, Emma realized that despite everything they had faced, they were stronger together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But, for the first time, she felt like they were truly building something meaningful, something bigger than themselves. The community center buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled the modest hall, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. At the front of the room, a simple podium stood adorned with a small banner that read, "The New Dawn Foundation, a place for healing and hope." Emma stood near the back, wringing her hands as her heart pounded. She had dressed simply, jeans and a soft sweater that clung to her frame, but her mind raced, second-guessing every choice she'd made leading up to this moment. Her story, her pain, was about to become public in a way she had never imagined. Edward approached her, his presence a steadying force. His eyes, though kind, carried the seriousness of the moment. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You ready?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice wavering. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can," Edward said with quiet confidence. "You've already done the hardest part, living through it. This is just sharing what you've learned." She nodded, though her hands still trembled. Edward squeezed her shoulder gently before stepping away to prepare for his own part in the event. The hall grew silent as Edward took the stage. His tailored suit was sharp but understated, his way of ensuring the focus wasn't on him, but on the mission they were launching. "Thank you all for being here," Edward began, his voice steady and warm. "This foundation is something I've thought about for a long time, but the truth is, I didn't have the courage to make it happen until someone very special came into my life and showed me what true resilience looks like." His gaze briefly found Emma in the crowd, and she felt her cheeks flush. "This isn't just about providing financial support," Edward continued. "It's about creating a space where women, where anyone, can feel safe, heard, and empowered. A place where they can reclaim their lives after facing challenges that no one should ever have to endure." The audience erupted into quiet applause as Edward stepped back from the podium. "And now," he said, his voice softer, "I'd like to introduce someone who has inspired me more than I can put into words. Emma Ward." Emma's legs felt like lead as she walked toward the stage. The applause swirled around her, distant and muffled, as if it were happening to someone else. She took her place behind the podium, gripping its edges like a lifeline. Her gaze swept over the room, rows of expectant faces, strangers who had no idea who she was or what she had been through. She took a deep breath and began. "I've spent a lot of my life hiding," she said, her voice unsteady at first. "Hiding from my past, from my pain, and most of all, from the fear of what people would think if they really knew me." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a chair. "I was married to a man who made me feel small, who made me believe I was worth nothing without him. And when I finally found the strength to leave, I thought that chapter of my life was over. But the scars don't disappear, just because the person is gone." She paused, her voice catching. Edward gave her a small nod of encouragement from his seat in the front row. "Meeting Edward," she continued, "made me realize how much I was still carrying, how much of myself I was still hiding, and how much I needed to forgive myself for." The weight of the past lifted with each word as her voice grew stronger. "This foundation isn't just about giving people a way out. It's about giving them a way forward, a chance to rewrite their story, to find strength in their pain, and to know they're not alone." Tears blurred her vision, but she let them fall. She looked at Edward, then back at the audience. "For so long, I thought my story was something to be ashamed of. But now, I see it as something that can help others. And that's what this foundation is about, turning pain into purpose." The room erupted into applause as Emma stepped away from the podium, her heart racing, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. After the event, Emma and Edward stood together near the refreshments table, surrounded by supporters and well-wishers. A woman approached Emma, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "Hearing your story, it made me feel like I wasn't alone." Emma felt her throat tighten, but she managed to smile. "You're not," she said, her voice steady. As the crowd thinned and the evening wound down, Emma turned to Edward. I don't think I've ever felt this free, she admitted. Edward smiled, his hand brushing hers. This is just the beginning, Emma. Together, we can make a difference. She nodded, a sense of hope swelling in her chest. For the first time, the weight of her past felt like something she could carry, not as a burden, but as a testament to her strength. The foundation, much like their relationship, was built on honesty, love, and purpose. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Emma knew she wasn't walking it alone. The soft light of dusk filtered through the trees of Crestwood Park, casting long, golden shadows over the familiar terrain. The air was thick with nostalgia, the scent of pine needles and fresh earth, stirring memories of childhood adventures. Emma walked slowly along the worn dirt path, her hand in Edward's, her heart steady, but curious. "I can't believe you brought me here," she said, her voice tinged with laughter. Edward smiled, his eyes scanning the park. "I figured it was time we came back to where it all began." The old oak tree stood ahead, its gnarled branches reaching out like welcoming arms. Beneath it lay a blanket, set with a basket and a bottle of wine. Emma's steps faltered, her brow furrowing as she turned to Edward. "What's this?" Edward shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but his eyes sparkled with mischief. "Just a little surprise." They sat beneath the oak, the bark rough against their backs as they reminisced. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, bathing the park in a dreamy glow. "You know," Emma said, her voice soft, "this place feels smaller now. When we were kids, it seemed endless." Edward chuckled. "That's because back then, it was our whole world. And now—" He paused, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Emma's breath caught as Edward kneeled before her, his expression open and vulnerable. "And now, I want you to be my whole world," he said. "Emma Ward, you've shown me strength I never knew existed. You've taught me how to love honestly and how to face fears I didn't even realize I had. I can't imagine a future without you." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring that caught the fading light. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she stared at him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and disbelief. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Edward. Of course, yes." Edward slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into an embrace. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the rustling leaves and the steady rhythm of their hearts. Their wedding was a small affair, held in the very park where Edward had proposed. Friends, family, and members of the foundation they had built together gathered beneath the oak tree, now adorned with twinkling lights and wildflowers. Emma wore a simple gown, her hair loose and flowing. Edward stood beside her in a tailored suit, his smile brighter than ever. As they exchanged vows, there was no mention of the hardships they had faced, only gratitude for the love and resilience that had brought them to this moment. When they kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers, the sound carrying through the park like a celebration of hope. That evening, as the reception wound down, Emma and Edward slipped away from the crowd, walking hand in hand through the quiet streets of Chicago. The city lights reflected in puddles left by a recent rain, the air cool and crisp. "I can't believe how far we've come," Emma said, her voice soft. Edward squeezed her hand gently. "And we're just getting started." They talked about the future, the expansion of the foundation, the lives they hoped to touch, the family they dreamed of building together. "We've turned so much pain into something beautiful," Emma said, her gaze thoughtful. "I never thought I'd feel this whole." Edward stopped, turning to face her. "That's because you are whole, Emma. You always were. It just took time to see it." She smiled, leaning into him as they continued their walk. The city bustled around them, but they moved through it with a quiet certainty. Two people who had faced the storm and emerged stronger for it. The foundation they had built wasn't just for others. It was a testament to their journey, a symbol of what love and resilience could create. As they turned the corner toward home, Emma looked up at Edward, her heart light. "No more running," she said softly. Edward smiled. "No more running," he echoed. Hand in hand, they stepped into the future, their path illuminated not just by the city's lights, but by the shared dream of a brighter tomorrow. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.